Welcome everybody to Module 8, where we are going to learn about the muscular system. So this is Chapter 6 in your book. And we're just going to kind of keep moving on throughout our content. Like I said, we're going to be pretty much looking at a new organ system every lecture. And this one we're going to focus on the muscular system. And so we're going to have an introduction to a video going over the introduction to muscles. Then we'll look at another video where we talk about how muscles contract and the kind of microscopic level at which that happens, so at the cellular level. And then we'll finish up looking at some types of different muscles and some diseases that can affect the muscular system. And so just to dive into it, we're going to start out with an introduction to muscles. So muscle tissue we find in every organ, whether it's most likely it's going to be smooth muscle, except for the heart where you have that cardiac muscle. They're going to be involuntary, where you don't have any type of like physical control over the movement of those organs or those muscles. So an example is your heart beating. And the activity of that muscle contraction requires energy, and it requires a lot of specific kind of processes to happen. And we'll look specifically at skeletal muscles in a little bit and learn exactly how skeletal muscles contract. The muscles that you use in every activity, or I should say every activity that you undergo, requires muscles for movement, so for you to perform that activity. And a lot of our body weight is or comes from the weight of muscle. So for example, in your average male, about 40% of the body weight is muscles, and in your average female, approximately 32% of their body weight comes from just muscle mass. Now, we have three different types of muscles, and we mentioned these in an earlier chapter. One is skeletal muscles. These muscles attach to the skeleton, and these are the voluntary muscles, so the muscles that we actually control, we think about moving and using, and they provide strength and mobility for our body. The remaining two types of muscle, the cardiac muscle and the smooth muscle, are involuntary, and cardiac muscle is found only in your heart, while smooth muscle is found in all of our organs, our blood vessels, the tubules that are found throughout various organ systems like the reproductive system and the urinary system. And so smooth muscles are found in a lot of different places throughout the body. And again, we'll talk about kind of the structure of each of these muscle types, and specifically look at how skeletal muscles contract and that process that has to happen to make that contraction and movement happen. Now, muscles, they produce movement by generating tension. And the type of movement, like we've already mentioned, it could be voluntary or involuntary. So voluntary is when we consciously control that movement. So for example, when we lift weights or we pick up a pen or we decide to go on a run or a walk, we're thinking about moving those muscles and we control the movement of those muscles. Involuntary muscles is where we don't have a conscious control. We have an unconscious control over that movement, and it just kind of does it on its own. So breathing, all of the muscles that are responsible with that process, the respiratory process, the beating of the heart, the smooth muscles that constrict or dilate our blood vessels, whenever we get hot or cold, all of that is involuntary movement of the smooth and cardiac muscle. Now, a lot of muscles are there to actually resist movement. So, for example, to help maintain posture. So, a lot of, our upright standing, our sitting upright, it wouldn't really be able to happen if we didn't have muscles that are kind of pulling against the posture and resisting kind of the forward falling movement in our lower back, and then also our abdominal muscles that are kind of helping with that upright posture. And then the maintenance of blood pressure is another example of this, where you can, the body can constrict and determine the circumference of the blood vessel, and they can contract the vessels when they need higher blood pressure. They can really dilate them, etc. And so it's resisting the movement of the blood throughout the body. And then another big function of muscles is that they generate heat. So every time your muscle contracts, the energy that's used in that contraction is not 100% efficient. And so what that means is that there's energy that's released as a result of that. Right? And so that energy process is not 100% efficient. That's why our car motors heat up. Anything that has a motor releases heat through the combustion of the fuel. And so our bodies are the same way, and the movement of our muscles are working kind of the same way, in that the ATP that's used for energy also releases heat as well as energy that's being used. And so that heat causes our bodies to heat up. And that's one reason why whenever you get cold, your muscles will shiver to generate that heat from the rapid contraction of those skeletal muscles. Okay, so speaking of contractions, the fundamental action or activity of a muscle is that contraction process. And so it contracts in response to an electrical or chemical stimulus. So, for example, as we'll learn in a little bit, for a skeletal muscle, a motor neuron will transmit an electrical signal to the target muscle cell. That electrical signal will cause calcium to be released, and that release of calcium allows for the muscle contraction to happen through several different kind of downstream steps. And so that electrical stimulus that comes from that motor neuron is what's stimulating that muscle contraction. And again, we'll look at that in much more detail in the second video for this module, whenever we look at exactly how muscles contract. And so all muscles will undergo this contraction. And basically what happens is whenever that electrical stimuli occurs, the muscles will shorten, they'll contract, and then they'll relax and lengthen back to their original state and original form. And again, we'll go through this in much more detail in the second video for this chapter. Before we do that, though, let's just kind of look at not all of the, but a big portion of the major muscles that are found throughout the human body. So we have about 600 skeletal muscles that are responsible for the movement of our body. And so they cause our bones to move. And so you want to be familiar with the muscles in this image. Okay? So you want to know where your masseter muscle is, right, which is responsible for opening and closing of the jaw. Your avicularis, which is around the lips. Your pectoralis major, which is basically your chest muscles. Your serratus anterior, which is the muscles kind of underneath your underneath your chest, kind of underneath your underarm. If you've ever kind of did like a bench press or push-ups, these muscles were probably sore as a response. Your biceps, which a lot of you are familiar with. your rectus abdominis, which is your abdominal muscles. Then you have your external oblique, which is right on the outside of those abdominal muscles, the lower portion of our abdomen. We have our adductor muscles, which are right on the inside of the leg here. Then the sartorius, which kind of wraps around those adductor muscles, goes from the outside to the lower inside of the knee. Then you have our quad group, which is right above the knee. And then you have the tibulus anterior, right, which is on the outside of our leg, which is near the tibia. And then if we look at the back area, we have our deltoid, which is kind of the shoulder muscle, which helps to raise the arm. The muscles that are in from the shoulder to the kind of spine area on the upper back is the trapezius. Then on the back of our arms, you have your triceps, and you have your lats in your lower back. Your butt muscles are your gluteus maximus. On the back of the leg, you have your hamstrings. Then underneath the knee, you have the gastrocnemius, which is the calf muscle. And then down at the foot, you have your Achilles tendon, which is not really a muscle, right? It's a tendon, but it connects the calf to the heel. Okay? And so again, you want to be familiar with the location and what these major muscle groups are, because it's very likely you'll see these on your lab exam, or you may even be questioned about them on your second exam. Okay. And so, like I mentioned, we have about 600 skeletal muscles in our bodies, and those skeletal muscles work together to allow our bones to move and our bodies to move. Now, our muscles can be what's known as synergistic or antagonistic. So, for example, synergistic muscles are muscles that work together, that's creating kind of the same movement. Okay? Antagonistic muscles are muscles that oppose one another. And an example of like your antagonistic muscle could be like your bicep or your tricep, where they are relaxing and contracting with one in response to the movement of the other, to allow your elbow to either flex or extend. Okay, so just kind of showing an image of that antagonistic movement. So you have your upper arm here, and you have your tricep here, and you have your bicep. So if you wanted to flex your arm, so bring your forearm up and reduce the angle of this joint here, your bicep would contract, and the tricep would relax, lengthening. Right? So those are opposite movements, so they're antagonistic of one another. If you wanted to extend your arm and increase that angle, your bicep would relax and the tricep would contract and shorten. And so that would allow for you to extend your arm and lengthen that muscle. Okay. Muscles will also, so we said muscles can attach to bones via tendons, right? We talked about this in the skeletal lecture as well. Now, where those muscles attach determines kind of the origin end of the muscle and the insertion end of the muscle. So the origin end of the muscle attaches to a stationary bone. Okay, so like your scapula. Scapula doesn't really move, and so any muscle that's attached to that would be the origin of the muscle. An insertion is where it attaches to another bone across the joint. Okay? And the action of that muscle insertion, it pulls the insertion towards the origin. Okay, and so looking at this in the figure we've already seen, we can kind of identify these different origins and insertions. So, for example, on the bicep, we have an origin, so that muscle connecting to the scapula via a tendon. And then that bicep muscle also attaches to the radius via the insertion. Okay. And notice the insertion is across that joint, right? And now when this bicep contracts, it pulls that insertion towards the area of the origin. Okay. So the origin is on that stationary bone, which is the scapula. The insertion is across the joint and it's going to be pulling that bone back. Okay. The tricep, for example, has origins on the scapula and the humerus. You can see how it's kind of attached to the lower end of the back end of the humerus. And then it inserts on the ulna across that across the elbow. Okay. And again, so you have your origin on your more stationary bone and your insertions connecting a muscle across the joint area. Okay. And so here we have just kind of showing those antagonistic movements again. So bicep contracting, tricep relaxing, opposite movements to flex, and then you get your tricep to contract and your bicep to relax to allow that forearm to or arm to extend. And so what we're going to look at now is the actual makeup of muscles and kind of how they're structured. And so muscles have this really interesting makeup, and I kind of like to think of it as a hierarchy of structures, where we refer to as a muscle that is made up of several muscle cells that are attached to the same origin and insertion points, and they all have the same function. So all those muscle cells have the same function. So for example, flexing or extending the arm, right? So for example, with your bicep. Now, these muscles, right, we said are made up of a group of muscle cells, but the way those muscle cells are grouped has this specific structure to it. So in our muscles, we have these bundles called fascicles, okay? And a fascicle is basically muscle fibers, which are also muscle cells, that are wrapped in connective tissue. Okay? So this is connective tissue is what we call fascia. Okay? So an example of this is, imagine you have like 100 straws, right? You know, straws like you drink a soda out of a cup with. So imagine you have like 100 straws and you wrap those straws with plastic wrap to keep them held together. Okay? That's essentially what a fascicle is, except here the straws are muscle cells and the plastic wrap is connective tissue. Okay? And so when you wrap those straws, you have a bundle of straws. And so when those muscle fibers are wrapped with the connective tissue, you have bundles of muscle fibers. Okay? So each muscle fiber that's in those fascicles are very long, right? They're tube shaped, and depending on the length of the muscle, that determines the length of the muscle cell. So they could be pretty short, so a few millimeters, to actually 30 centimeters in length. And now, like we've mentioned, skeletal muscles, as well as, so let's say, for example, skeletal muscles, they're multinucleate, right? So they have many different nuclei in the same muscle cell. And they have what's called myofibrils, which are long cylindrical protein or structures that are made up of two different proteins called actin and myosin. And so this is where that hierarchy kind of starts to come in. So you have a fascicle, which is a bundle of muscle fibers that's wrapped by connective tissue. And then you have a muscle fiber that is made up of long proteins known as actin and myosin. Okay. And so let's just kind of show this first hierarchy structure with this figure. So here we have a bicep. So we have our whole muscle, right? So this muscle is made up of thousands of muscle cells that all have the same insertion point, same origin point, and same function. These muscle cells are put into different bundles called fascicles, and all of these muscle cells, so each little kind of tube structure here, right, is a muscle cell, and you can see that single muscle cell extended, and they're wrapped with that connective tissue, which is this pink structure. That's the fascia. Okay. Now, if we take this muscle cell and we zoom into it, this is what you would see. So this is one muscle cell. Oh, it's right there. So that's one muscle cell. Okay. Now, within the muscle cell, you have these cylindrical myofibril units, and these myofibrils are made up of the actin and myosin proteins. Okay? And we'll learn all about those in the second video of this chapter, where we talk about the contraction of muscle cells. Okay? What we also can see here is that you have your single muscle cell, right, which is this cell here, and the multiple nuclei, sorry with the red, it's kind of hard to see, the multiple nuclei that that cell has. So it's multinucleate. Okay? What's also important with these muscle cells, especially for skeletal muscles, because they use so much energy, because they're like our movement cells, they're packed with mitochondria. So they're packed with those organelles that's going to allow for cellular respiration to happen to generate ATP. Okay. All right, so what we're going to look at now is an animation talking about muscle structure and function. And then in the next video, we're going to look at exactly how muscle contractions happen.
Muscles are composed of some of the longest cells in the body. A single muscle cell, also called a muscle fiber, extends from one end of a muscle to the other. If you take a closer look at a muscle into its interior, you will see that muscle fibers are grouped into cylindrical bundles. A look into a muscle fiber shows that each fiber also contains its own cylindrical bundles. These bundles, called myofibrils, consist of structures called sarcomeres stacked end to end. Sarcomeres are the contractile units of the cell. A network of interconnected tubes.
All right. And so we're going to just pause the video here, because we're going to pick up in the next video looking at the kind of structures of these myofibrils and sarcomere units, and look at how they're important in causing the muscles to contract. Okay. And so with that, we'll see you in the next video.